So if you're taking this course and you have an invention and it's not computer related, you can skip this next part. Now remember, in order to get a patent examiner makes sure that you have a type of invention that is eligible. It's not considered abstract. What eligible means is that, well, let's pretend you have a ball. This is your invention, and you have to get it into one of four basket types in order to make sure that you're okay to apply for a patent. These four baskets are machine, process, article of manufacture, and composition of matter. If you can't get into one of these baskets and your invention ball hits the floor, then it's considered abstract, and your invention is not really eligible to get a patent. But remember, these are really big baskets, and most people get them into the basket. There are also these little rods or prongs here on a conveyor belt above these baskets. Well, these are the invention types that are specifically a no-no. You have to avoid these prongs with throwing into the basket. Well, now, some of these prongs have been specifically defined as computer-related. Data per se is a no-no, and computer programs per se are also no-no. If you throw your invention ball, it'll block it from going into one of these buckets. So is that it? Software is not eligible? Well, not exactly. And here's the history of this. In the 60s and 70s, you could not get a patent on any sort of computer program unless it was merged with physical components. Well, then in the 80s was sort of the first crack of the wall. Someone got a patent on a process for heating rubber where the parameters were calculated by a computer. But still, it wasn't really clear what needed to be done to get a patent on a computer-related invention, and there was a lot of confusion about this. Well, then, as computers became more ubiquitous in the 90s, they said if the computer program was just moving numbers around, then no, that's not patentable, that's abstract. But if the numbers themselves represent real-world parameters, then that's okay. Well, then also in the 90s, somebody pulled a clever trick that said, if you think about it, programs aren't abstract data structures, but computer programs are actually physical things, and these physical things exist in a particular configuration in the memory of the computer. So in actuality, a program should be considered a device, which is patentable. And that actually worked. Well, we can toss that into one of two buckets of the machine or an article of manufacture. Then in the late 90s, the court ruled that any sort of algorithm or business method that produces a useful, concrete, tangible result should be considered patentable. And since software is an algorithm on some level and it's usually used to affect things in the real world, then lots of programs and software could now be patented, and we can throw it in the process bucket. So now, if we have an invention ball that's a computer-related invention, we can probably throw it in a machine bucket, or a process bucket, or an article of manufacture bucket pretty easily. Then it started to pull back a bit. In the late 2000s, there was a case that said, whoa, just because software or a method for doing something can be new, the invention has to actually be tied to a physical thing, or if not that, transforms something into another thing. They recommended that this be called the machine or transformation test. Well, then they were like, oh, well then software patents don't work, because if the invention has to be tied to a physical machine, or transforming a physical machine, then that causes a lot of problems for processed patents. So while we can still throw this into the machine bucket or article of manufacture bucket, we now can't throw it in the process bucket. Then another court case a couple of years later said, yeah, about that test. We think you guys did a good job and everything. That decision was, of course, a hard problem to figure out, but we think the machine or transformation test should just be one of the factors to determine if a process is patentable, not the factor. Okay, we can start shooting at the process bucket again. Well, at this point, software is pretty much okay. So we're back at three buckets that we could get them in with relative ease. It's machine, process, or article of manufacture. Then in 2014, there was a court case called the Alice case. It was a case where there were some patents on financial trading systems, particularly regarding how a computer program helped mediate a settlement between two partners. Well, the court said that the idea of a settlement itself is an old and abstract idea. Just because you added a computer to it doesn't make it any less abstract. Okay, never mind that something that is an abstract, real-world problem makes no sense, and that an invention that solved the real-world problem used to be the exact definition of what made something not abstract. So what's the definition of an abstract real-world problem? Nothing. Crickets. There is no real guidance on what that means, but the law still implements it, as software patents are now being rejected as abstract, whereas before, you pretty much just had to solve a problem in the real world. Well, now, the type of problem that your invention solves factors into whether or not you can be eligible for a patent. As of October 2017, the Patent Office actually has guidelines where they've added some more pegs to the conveyor belt. Now we're adding an idea in and of itself as a peg, certain methods of organizing human activities as a peg, and fundamental economic practices as a peg, and mathematical relationships and formulas as a peg. These are some of the types of problems that if your computer-related invention solves, then it's going to be much harder for you. Well, they list a bunch of court cases as examples of what this might mean rather than specific guidelines, but this is what sucks, because if you knew exactly what the criteria were, then you just wouldn't apply at all because you'd fall into these particular categories. However, what really is considered an abstract real-world problem is nebulous. Should you just not apply because you can't figure out whether it's eligible or not? That doesn't seem like a good idea. The reality is, in the absence of clear guidelines, there is added risk that your invention can be interpreted this way, but it doesn't necessarily mean that your invention will be excluded.